The following programming is made possible through a generous donation from Randall Lewis, Executive Vice President of Upland-based Lewis Operating Companies.
Welcome again to another video of a Randall Lewis seminar. Last night, Thursday, November 17th, we had really an exceptional seminar and it was framed with this question, responding to California's major fire challenges, how communities plan and operate under the Master Mutual Aid System. A kind of long way of saying is, how does this happen? You and I see on television fires and emergencies. We see command centers, we see fire trucks, we see helicopters and planes. But the question that resulted in the seminar, how does this happen? How do all these things that we see and depend upon and look to? And it is one of the major success stories of coordination. There's an old saying that the government's the problem, not the solution. And this is an example of government being the solution by working together. And last night we heard how this puzzle happens and what the pieces are. And so I'm really excited to introduce to you our guest, Mike Esparza. Began as a firefighter in the city of Riverside, and then retired as interim fire chief. Mike, you were also involved, not simply what happened in the city, but you were served on a variety of state boards over time, right, during your service?
Yes, Ron, I was very fortunate. I spent 20 years on the California State Board of Fire Services, and it's a governor appointee position. I've served with 16 other members there, and there we worked on making training standards for the fire service. We also reviewed fire prevention laws and various things. So it was quite an honor. I've served every governor since Wilson, actually.
So you saw fire service from a state perspective.
Yes, and what was really nice for me is that I got to work with folks that were the kind of the mover and shakers of the fire service in California. And it's a very broad board because it includes the insurance industry, it includes a government official, it includes labor in terms of fire service labor, volunteers, fire chiefs. Is really a wide spectrum of people on this group.
So it's not all firefighters?
No, it's not. So it was a very good experience for me. And after my 20 years serving on the state board, I was appointed to the Fire Scope Board, which is the board that I'm on now.
What is the Fire Scope Board?
Well, the Fire Scope Board mostly consists of folks that are just in the fire service, leaders in the fire service. And this board actually started due to the major fires that happened in Southern California.
Yeah, and big fires are increasing. I don't know what the number's right in terms of the amount of acreage consumed by fires. That number is going up over time, right?
Well, it is. It's not always consistent. It really depends on weather and like for instance, right now we're in a drought, and so the issues of fires and the potential for large fires is very great.
Again, I think you sort of framed it well last night. What's the mission of the fire service? What's fire service about?
Well, certainly the fire service is, the purpose is to put out fires. If you look at the mission statements of almost every fire department in the United States, you'll see that our purpose or our mission is to protect life, property, and the environment. And with that is sort of a wide umbrella of things that we do. We respond to medical emergencies, rescues, hazardous material incidents, and of course fires.
And there's a whole variety of natural emergencies that you respond to.
Well, most definitely. We can have flooding. In some cases, lightning starts fires. And then, of course, there's the man-made type of emergencies. We have terrorism that we deal with now and other complexities that we didn't have to deal with many, many years ago.
Two things that you said last night I think were interesting about yourself. One was what you did in Katrina, and the other what happened on 9/11. But maybe you could just highlight those, because I think, again, they point up the beyond being in a fire station and answering local calls, how your work takes you beyond city boundaries.
Well, sure. Yeah, the experience of a chief officer or any firefighters to be trained to the level that we've trained in Riverside has allowed us to respond to emergencies way beyond our borders. I responded to the 9/11 incident as part of our urban search and rescue team in the city of Riverside Fire Department. And in that response, I was a communications specialist, so I played a role in the team that responded there.
How did you do that by being in Riverside?
Well, years prior, we had an opportunity to participate in a brand new program, a nationwide program called the Urban Search and Rescue Program. It was sponsored by FEMA and also California Office of Emergency Services. When we looked at that, we realized that in Riverside, though we had some training and some ability to respond to earthquakes and other disasters in our city, in reality we were limited. We didn't have the training and equipment. And by participating in this program, we were going to receive a huge grant that would allow us to train our folks on how to respond to those things. In addition, we were going to get $1 million worth or so of equipment. So fortunately, the fire chief, the city manager, and the council looked at this issue and allowed us to get into the program.
So that's what brought you outside the city limits on major national disasters.
Yes.
Tell us, the Katrina one I thought was interesting. You want to just, what happened when you went to New Orleans?
Well, that was a terrible disaster for the people of New Orleans, and the FEMA requested that our urban search and rescue teams respond and assist to that disaster. Riverside's urban search and rescue team did respond. I responded as the task force leader on that incident.
So you arrived in New Orleans, then what role did you have there?
Well, as a task force leader, there was 2 of us, and they were looking for leadership to help run sections or areas of this disaster. So they tapped me to be a division supervisor. And with that, it was just honestly even amazing to me. But in the group that I was in charge of, we had 2 urban search and rescue teams, the Orange County Rescue Team, the Riverside Rescue Team, but we also had the 82nd Airborne assigned to me. We had a Navy component assigned to me. We had the Army Reserve assigned to me. We had some law enforcement from out of state assigned to me. We had just a variety of folks that responded and worked under the leadership that I was providing as division supervisor, but of course the leadership of the whole team, the incident management team.
We were back in the 19th century. What kind of fire service would we discover?
Well, let me take you a little bit back to 1736. Most people don't know this, but Ben Franklin is considered the father of the modern fire service. Prior to his efforts, the fire service was solely focused on self-help. If you had a fire in your house or your business, you had to take care of yourself. Maybe the community would come in with fire buckets. You see on this slide here, we have some buckets filled with water and throw it at the water.
I mean, you see in movies, you see one of the funny things you see, right? Is these long lines of people, each passing buckets along to toss on a fire. With what effect? Pretty modest effect, right?
So you're right, Ron, that the community would take these buckets and they would throw water on the fire, but honestly they weren't very effective. Interestingly, the community started forming fire clubs, if you will, to work on fire issues, putting out fires in the community, but they were only focused on protecting the people who were part of their club. Insurance companies also formed these clubs, but they were only worried about protecting the folks that they were insuring. If you see in this slide here, you see some plaques on the bottom called fire marks. Businesses or houses, they would put the fire mark in front of their house, and when there was a fire, and these clubs would come and respond to these fires, and if you didn't have their mark, they wouldn't put out the fire. This is where Ben Franklin comes in. He realizes the need to provide fire protection for the whole community, no matter whether they can afford fire insurance or not. So he formed the Union Fire Brigade, as I recall.
So in the beginning, these are really kind of you call them clubs, but they were private rather than public, essentially fire service.
Yes, and typical of probably a lot of disasters. It's in the fire service, it's kind of the same way. When you have a really bad incident, if you have a local disaster, then you really get the attention of the public and other people, and they start addressing those needs. And that's exactly what Ben Franklin did. They had a devastating fire in Philadelphia, and he was successful at forming this team.
So we initially did not have fire services as we recognize now, and so tell us a little bit about this transition. How do we move from this sort of whether insurance companies or by clubs and private? How do we move from that kind of service to where there's now much more of a public service?
Well, we see kind of an evolution in the fire service, if you will, and so as the need becomes more and more apparent that we need to organize in the United States during the Industrial Revolution, we see a rapid growth of buildings, populations moving into the city, and there's not a lot of there's not of attention being paid to fire prevention issues. Consequently, we have devastating fires.
Like the big one they had in Chicago that they always talk about.
Exactly, as an example. So it became very apparent to leadership in the communities and government that they needed to form a full-time professional fire service. And that's where you see these fire brigades, if you will, or these fire clubs turning into volunteer fire departments and then eventually becoming paid fire departments and providing the service to the communities as we do now.
Just one, it's a side note, but why not volunteer? Why do we need professional firefighters if you can have a volunteer service?
Well, that's a good question, but in the modern fire service now, there are so many specialties that we have to have. Even in my 36 years in the fire service, what I needed to know in 1980 is so much different than in 2016. You know, we didn't think a lot about responding to hazardous materials incidents or acts of terrorism or active shooters incidents. So we've had to continue to increase our knowledge and our skill sets. So typically a volunteer firefighter is working full-time, and to have a full-time knowledge and awareness and training of being a firefighter and then provide that service, it's very difficult for a community to be served to its fullest potential.
Yeah, if I'm a voluntary firefighter, am I at the fire station or am I at my job?
Well, it depends on the community that has volunteer firefighters. You know, the other factor about volunteer fire departments is some communities can't afford to have full-time fire service, so they rely on the volunteers. But many of those volunteers are, in fact, at work, and then they get called to respond to the emergency. That's rather typical. Occasionally, some fire departments require their volunteers to spend a little bit of time at the station.
One of the things that you talked about is how quickly fires, you hear it in the sirens and the need to get to a fire on time. Why is it important to show up on a timely way at a fire?
Well, fires, I like to use this rule of thumb. It's not very scientific, but I like to say fire doubles every minute. So fire essentially exponentially increases. And so it's our desire to try to get to a fire within 5 minutes of it being reported. The reason for that is as fire continues to grow, all the elements that are in a structure, in a house, heat up. Temperatures up to the roof exceed 1,000 degrees. So now you have all these elements in the house that are essentially emitting fumes that are just waiting to catch fire. And when it gets to a certain point, ignition point, it all explodes in fire. We have a flashover. So it's our desire to get to a house, let's say, and get there before that happens. So if there's anybody overcome by smoke, we can rescue them before that happens.
Part of the reason for this seminar was not so much what good work is done within cities or within fire districts, but how when there are these major fires or major emergencies. One, it's the scale of them, that this is not simply a single house burning or an accident. Talk Tell us a little bit about I mean, when you start talking about major fires, the scale of these.
Well, I'd like to point out the short video clip we have here regarding a fire that happened in the 60s, the early 60s. In this video, it really it's a news clip from the early 60s, and it talks about the devastation. It actually shows some of the houses burning. You'll see some of the firefighters not wearing any safety gear that we're used to now, doing their best to save the homes and the people in that area. But it was a much different environment then, and I like talking about this because while the fires haven't changed, the complexity has. So what have we done in the California Fire Service to be able to protect our state in a better way?
The worst fire in Southern California history rages through the foothills in the Bel Air and Brentwood districts of Los Angeles County. The blaze raced with incredible swiftness through the brush-choked canyons of the Santa Monica Mountains, and before it was contained, it had destroyed more than 450 homes. 14,000 acres are burned out, and damage is roughly estimated at upwards of $20 million. Squadrons of planes drop tons of a fire-retarding borate solution as the battle to check the fire goes on for days. The area is suffering its third straight year of drought, and the trees and brush were tinder ready for any spark to set off the conflagration.
I want to share that really the science of fire really hasn't changed. It's still as powerful and devastating. It's still, the devastation really is still based on the fuel, the weather, and topography. What has changed over time has been the complexity. We have people that have bought homes or built homes in the hillsides and the mountains and so forth. And so as we see the change in our communities, we see how these fires now burning many times in the same places they did in the 30s, 40s, and 50s. And
there are more people and more building, more structures there.
Yes, and so that becomes quite devastating.
Well, before that, you mentioned we get this, which the focus were. How do you put this kind of cooperative effort together? You were suggesting, for example, you have hoses that wouldn't work together. They had radios that you couldn't talk to each other. Can you just comment on that, which was true, I guess, in the middle part of the 20th century?
Sure, I'd be glad to share that. My father-in-law joined the fire service in 1949, and he was one of my mentors, if you will. So it was very interesting to talk to him what it was like in the fire service in the 60s. In the 60s, you start seeing fire departments get two-way radios, and they're on the fire engine. They don't have radios they can carry with them, and if they do have them, they're big. So we have an improvement in communications within their fire department, but when you have a devastating fire and you have to call for assistance from other agencies, they have a different radio system, and there's no way to communicate and coordinate these fires. So it became very difficult to fight these fires. Sometimes you had duplicated efforts at these fires. Sometimes you had areas of the fires that weren't even attended to because of miscommunications.
So walk us through it, because of what this whole business of how the city resources and county resources and state resources and federal resources are being brought together on these major fires. And it's obviously not accidental. People just don't sort of show up. Walk us through how this happens.
Well, we have a very well-defined system now that because of all these disasters that we've seen over the years, for instance, in 1970, in 13 days, we lost 16 lives, 772 structures lost, and over 500,000 acres burned. And we see these through time, from the 70s, the 80s, and the 90s, even 2000.
Yeah, we just had the major fire up in Cajon Pass, didn't we?
That's a good example. Now, just referring to this slide that shows 1970, this is something that repeats over time. And we have other incidents, but after 1970, Governor Reagan, started a task force called FireScope, and this group consisted of membership of the Fire Service, League of Cities, and various other groups where they talked about this problem, and they decided that we needed to modernize and come up with better ways of protecting the folks that lived in California from the devastation of fires. Because of this group, FireScope, we were able to start focusing on the needs that we have to better provide those services and to help minimize the damages from these devastating fires. We focused on, which became the Instant Command System and a multi-agency coordinating system.
Instant Command, and explain, put in more layman's language, what are we talking about, Instant Command?
Certainly. So the Instant Command System is essentially was invented by the fire service in the 70s. And what it is just it's a management system. It's utilizing management by objectives. It takes into account that not one fire agency can take care of all emergencies by themselves. So how do we integrate? So we had to start coming up with common terminology, common way of managing a fire. When there's multi-agencies involved, because a fire doesn't stop at a city border, we started learning that we need to come up with a unified command. We needed to work together with common goals to successfully mitigate the emergency.
Well, let's take the Cajon fire. How does this Instant Command and the resources begin to come together and focus on these major fires?
Well, obviously we get the response. We send a certain level of firefighting effort to the fire. We send a chief officer to the fire. Whoever gets there first, whether it's a captain on a fire engine.
But how do they know? I mean, for Riverside, the fire department gets a phone call, an email, a smoke signal. How do you? What's the connections that and the ability to respond? And how do you decide? Well, how do the connection gets? Okay. One of the things you showed last night was this wonderful room of people who are sitting on a fire, dealing with weather and dealing with the complexities of providing backup services and where people go and all that. And tell us and I guess there are places in the state, there are regions in the state which have specific kind of centers for this kind of effort?
Oh, yes, you're right. So of course, naturally, it starts with a 911 call to our public safety dispatch centers, and then every agency has their own response protocol. So depending on the emergency and the sound of the emergency in terms of what the information we get will dictate the initial response. And the beauty of the Instant Command System is when someone gets there and they take charge of the incident, they evaluate what they have and where we think this incident's going to go. How big is it going to be? So we grow the incident using this management system. When it gets very large, typically over 24 hours, it's very important that we order well-trained folks to manage certain aspects of that fire, key aspects. We generally see on TV the operations chief running the troops, but there's more to that in the background. We bring in a finance officer who runs all the finances, that deals with costs, purchasing items that we need for the fire, workers' comp issues. We have logistics experts that come in, and they're in charge of making sure that camp is set up, that we feed the folks when they need to be fed. They order and provide fuel for our fire engines. I already shared with you operations. They're essentially running the fire and making sure the troops are operating cohesively and safely. And then we have a planning component, and the planning folks, they're planning ahead. Where's this fire going? What are our needs?
They're all in the same room?
They're all in the same area.
Same area.
So the larger the fire, the more complex the fire, the more staffing that's going to be given to these folks.
What you always see on television is helicopters and the dropping from planes. Where do they come from?
Well, this is very interesting. So some fire agencies have their own helicopters and their own airplanes. Some departments actually contract out. The federal government contracts out with private companies to provide that service. So they're part of that response system. So when I arrive to an emergency and I take command of the fire and I realize that it's a significant fire and we need aerial support, we call them in. Now again, much like the line firefighters, everybody in this chain, or all these components that are in this fire, all have to be trained, they have to be qualified, and they have to know the incident command system so that they can integrate into that incident cohesively.
As you say it, it sounds easy, but is it, this is training, this is, as you saw, protocol, this is, how do all these pieces actually get together and work?
Well, it really is practice over time. When this incident command system was started, we being the fire service, ran an incident concurrently with the old system to validate it. And once we validated it and understood that it worked, we started teaching it to the fire service. And it was so good that the federal government has adopted that as a model program. So to answer your question, I joined the fire service in the 80s, and I was taught the system, and I learned how it operates. So all of us coming through the fire service were taught the same thing, the same language, the same methodologies. And so as I would come in, and as I shared with you, I was a qualified division supervisor. So I would have airplanes assigned to me, and I would direct them in on what I needed.
One of the things you showed up in last night, you had this wonderful chart of the resources of the state. And maybe you want to just identify what that, which again emphasizes the importance of this sort of shared responsibility that now exists.
In 1993, at the Topanga fire, the old Topanga fire, we were able to get 180 strike teams committed to the incident within 24 hours.
Strike team is?
Strike team is 5 engines and a leader. Each fire engine has 3 or 4 firefighters on there. So we amassed this massive bit of mutual aid. So every fire agency every morning takes an inventory of what and who they have on duty and what they're able to offer to the mutual aid system. Additionally, in the city of Riverside, as an example, we have 2 fire engines that belong to the Governor's Office Emergency Services. They're not staffed, but they're cross-staffed. So in the event that there is an emergency in the state, we can take on-duty staff and put it on those engines and send them.
So there's 2 state engines in the city of Riverside?
In the city of Riverside proper. So if you look at this, the state of California, OES specifically, has offered, and now you see a slide here, we have over 114 fire engines strategically located throughout the state, as well as other type of engines, 15 or more wildland fire engines, 4-wheel drive engines that are able to go and fight wildland fires specifically. So we have all these resources strategically located. What's kind of interesting is that about half of the fire service is off duty at any given time in a 24-hour period. So much like the reserve in the military, we have a reserve that we can actually draw from and bring them into the fire department and staff engines that are on standby, if you will, and respond statewide to any emergencies. So these are the state resources you see on this slide. But if you look at this next slide, it kind of demonstrates really the kind of resources that's throughout California. We have about 3,500 structure fire engines staffed every day throughout California. This includes volunteer and paid fire departments. We have various other fire engines. So we have almost 6,000 in total fire engines throughout the state of California, various types, off-road, wildland, structure engines. And we have the ability in the state to amass between 200 and 250 strike teams in a sense, at a given moment. There certainly is a process for it, but we have a lot of resources available to help Californians. I would like to share that no one agency is so big they can take care of all their emergencies by themselves. And it really wouldn't be a cost-effective method to the taxpayers if we staff for, say, a 9/11 incident or a conflagration every day. So we staff for the typical bad day that we would have in a location, and then rely on this mutual aid system to augment.
What you mentioned, I think, for the city of Riverside, there is 14 engines which are available in the city. But if you needed more than that, you'd have to call for help, right?
Yes, so in the city of Riverside, as we speak today, we have 14 fire stations, 14 fire engines. Fire engines carry hose and water and staffing, basically. We have 3 trucks. Those are the ladders and the aerials, and they don't carry water typically. They have equipment, tools, ladders, and staffing, and so we only have so much that we can draw upon. If we have a major fire incident or other incident in the city of Riverside, we draw within our own resources, but only to a point of drawdown because we still have other emergencies going on in the city. So that's where we exercise that mutual aid system, where we get help from other agencies.
Who's deciding what cities respond and how you put these different strike teams together? Is there some separate place that this is happening?
Well, as an example, each agency, each fire chief talks to their neighboring chiefs, and we have either written or verbal agreements on helping each other. But it goes beyond that. The day-to-day, we can ask. It's I like to call it neighbors helping neighbors. Certainly, I need help today, they may need help tomorrow, kind of a thing. But then from there, it gets more formalized. If we have an incident that's particularly devastating, maybe it's going to last several days, which we call operational periods, there's a built-in system that we can access help. And it starts from, for instance, the city of Riverside asking the neighbors. They help to their ability. If they're not able to fulfill all the needs of the city of Riverside, we go throughout the county to get resources. And the county agencies, city and county, helps. And if they're not able to provide all the resources that are needed, then we go to a region. In this particular slide, you can see that there's regions. So as I shared with you, there's individual fire agencies in a county. A county is called an operational area. There's a fire chief that's selected amongst all the chiefs in that county to operate as a coordinator for that county. And we pre-approve in the morning what's available to help our neighbors. And then we expand out to the region, and then the region helps us. And then when that region is depleted, then we go to the next region. And then when that's depleted, then we'll go to the state. And then the state will help move resources up and down the state.
Again, when you watch it on television, who controls the helicopters and planes? Where do they come from?
Well, there's protocol and need. So certain incidents that are, say, in the forest or in the state forest responsible areas, which it's pre-designated to respond these on that incident itself. So we can expect that we're going to get air resources to assist us. It's very much like a military operation where you have a commander, you have areas of duty and responsibility everybody has, and you have all these different assets that come in. For instance, the military, of course, we have the Marines, the Army, and the Navy, and the Air Force, and so forth. So it's really much like them, where they just come in and they converge into the incident, and the people in charge are already pre-trained, pre-practice in doing this, and they coordinate the attack.
You mentioned Katrina and 9/11. Were you involved in any major fires in California itself?
Well, several, and
just talk a little bit. I mean, which one, in terms of your own service, Mike, comes to mind? Of it?
Well, I think that one of the things that was interesting to me, and I have a slide here that I would share that kind of brings memories to me. I actually started the fire service in Los Angeles County, and I worked for a year on a hand crew. So here I find myself many years later as a chief officer responding to the Verdale fire, which is a community in Los Angeles County, in charge of a division, a section of this fire, primarily to protect that community from the fire that's coming to them. And so in this slide I'm showing here, the bottom left, there's my vehicle in Los Angeles County fire. And so we're a fire department of a little over 200 firefighters, and LA County is a fire department of over 2,000 firefighters. So with my qualifications, I was called in to assist them with this fire and help them. So this is part of that California mutual aid process. From there, unfortunately, the fire weather was so severe that we had a ember that traveled over a mile and started a fire in Ventura County called the Simi fire. And from there I went to that fire. Yeah. So that was several weeks of firefighting that was pretty significant.
You began to say, and on top of all this, I have to understand what weather is about. Do you have GPS kind of? Talk a little bit about where the sort of latest kind of tools that the fire services is using.
From the original goals, over time, the fire service has just built on these concepts and the needs that we had. And in order to be more efficient and effective, we have to take advantage of the most modern tools that we have. Fire weather is a significant factor to us, and it's important in the fire service that we understand what's expected. It's amazing to me that in the morning I get briefed at a fire, and a weather expert will tell me about 3 o'clock the weather is going to change and it's going to look like this. You have to be on alert for this because the fire is now going to burn downhill instead of uphill like we've been experiencing. And usually within 15 minutes, maybe 30 minutes, that's exactly what happens. And so why is that important? It's important for firefighter safety, but it's also important for the community because the fire is going to change direction. So as time has gone on from the 70s on to current modern times, our ability to get that information quicker, sooner is so important. We have a program that we use now that's an emerging program and is just starting to get adopted by the fire service called SCOUT. It stands for Situational Awareness and Collaboration Tool. And in this program, we're able to dial up real-time weather, topography maps. We're able to see the communities that are at risk. We're able to draw on this map an area to find out census data so we know how many people are at risk and where the fire is going and how many people we need to move out of the area. This particular slide actually shows where fire stations are, where city boundaries are, where parks are, where hospitals are. If we were to need to evacuate a lot of people, we want to know where the parks are, where we can take these folks. If we need to set up a command center, we need a large area, we can go to certain parks. So this tool here is really cutting edge. The other thing that it does is it gives us the ability to track where our fire engines are.
How do you know where they are or where they're coming or?
Well, historically, say in the 80s when I was sent to a fire in Northern California, we get the call, we gear up, we leave, and we go, and then we don't hear from anybody until we get there. And when we get there, after 10 hours of drive, we find out that they had canceled us 6 hours earlier. So you see that system isn't very efficient. Certainly with radio communication that has improved over the years, but now with tracking and cell phones, if we send somebody to a fire and they have to drive for 10 hours and we want to cancel them or send them to another emerging fire somewhere else, we can actually see which strike teams are the closest to the new fire and we can divert them there. So it's real-time movement of our folks. It's also real-time safety for our firefighters because the incident commander can actually see where they are in this devastating fire and move them out of the bad areas and direct them to good areas that are safe and an area where we can fight and protect the community.
So your own lifetime of service, you've seen very, very major changes in the way that this whole mutual aid thing works.
Well, the advancement's been terrific, and really, when I first joined the fire service, one of my instructors shared with us what he called the disaster theory, and I didn't understand that, but disaster theory really, as he explained it, was it takes a disaster to raise the awareness enough that we advance to the next level. So I think this is probably true with a lot of professions where professionals can see what improvements are needed, but it's hard to sell that and it's hard to the general community to understand that. So as we've had these various fires where firefighters were lost or we've lost civilian life, we've analyzed those incidents and we said, how do we improve and how do we get to the next level? So I've seen that transition over 36 years, and where we are now is just amazing. We've even seen the use of the Air Force several years ago. We called upon the assistance of the military because we're realizing they have assets that we could use.
Well, it's the drone thing. Is the fire department going to invest in drones to help scout out these directions of fires and where they're going?
Well, I think that is quite a possibility. The ability to instantaneously see what the fire is doing and change our objectives and change our tactics instantaneously, as opposed to waiting to see what the fire's done in a particular 12-hour period and then adjust our objectives to the incident, is quite an advancement. And I do see that there will be some type of unmanned aerial vehicles that will be used. But again, with advancements, there's expenses, so we'll have to analyze that and see if we can afford that and then utilize it.
Well, talk a little bit about that. All this stuff that we see, who pays for it?
Well, the taxpayers, of course, so we have to be very considerate of where we're spending our monies and where we're researching and so forth. But every fire agency certainly has the ability to invest in technologies to better their fire department.
But you said locally, if you went to aid Moreno Valley or Europa Valley, that just becomes part of part of your regular budget?
Yes, so that's a very good question. So typical day-to-day mutual aid, neighbors helping neighbors, there's no reimbursement. For instance, using City of Riverside as an example, if Corona needs help, we have the ability to send them help, and vice versa, or Moreno Valley or Hoopa Valley, or even unincorporated
So
areas.
that's neighbors helping.
Neighbors helping neighbors.
When you were going your 10 hours up to Northern California, well, how about all the infrastructure, the food, the logistics? Does FEMA partly reimburse fires, or?
Well, again, that's a very good question. So the way the mutual aid agreement is set, the local agencies help at a fire the first 12 hours for free, whether it's in the federal forest or state forest areas or just helping another community. There's no reimbursement. So again, we never know when we'll need the help, so it's neighbors helping neighbors. But when we get these fires that are in the federal forest area or the state responsible area, which is the wildland component of the state CAL FIRE areas, there is built-in funds to help reimburse cities and counties, fire agencies for their response.
Or for their strike teams.
Right. So every agency develops a sheet that identifies the cost to run a fire engine by the hour and the administrative costs, and then we submit that to the governor's office, and then when we're all done, we turn in some paperwork, and then the federal government reimburses us.
You know, this puzzle, which you've, I think, beginning to put these pieces together, that and the key to this, I guess, as you point out, one, it's cooperation, it's continue learning and continue improving and using the best new technology to try to do it better.
Mm-hmm. Most definitely, we have to advance. It's our duty. When we talked about the mission of the fire service, you know, this is where it ties in. You know, it's our duty to protect the community that we work for, but also we've expanded that to the state. And so I think it's just every fire chief's job, every firefighter's job to train well, to be able to help each other and to utilize all advancements in technology so we become an effective and efficient fire service for the people.
I know we heard a lot about after 9/11 when the our team came back, but maybe we also need to hear some stories when you go to the Cajon or what has taken place and this kind of cooperation and effective cooperation that results. Because I think it's a lesson not only for fire but for many other fields. If we can figure out how to cooperate, coordinate, work better together, the results will be better. So this original premise was, how does this work? Is there things, Mike, that we have not covered you want to emphasize of how this puzzle of working together happens? It sounds like you're emphasizing the professionalism, the fire services to figure this out. Is any other kind of points you'd like to make?
Well, I may be reiterating a little bit, but we have a standard practice in the fire service. From the time somebody joins the fire service, they are training in all the multiple aspects, the all hazards that we respond to. And that includes wildland fires. So this is where you get a city fire department like Corona and Riverside now has to train in wildland, which is just fine because it's necessary. And so
all you have to do is take a hose out and squirt water on it. What do you need to be trained?
It seems that easy, but if it was that easy, we wouldn't be injuring firefighters. We wouldn't be losing public members from fires. So what I would like to share is that from the very beginnings of one joining the fire service, we're training and teaching them how to perform and how to be a part of this larger service. If you could compare this, say, to a corporation, a business, or perhaps, let's say, a high school, there's hierarchy built into those organizations. You have a principal, you have vice principals, and so forth. And in a sense, that's what we do in the fire service. We have our day-to-day operations, but we know how to melt into any organization and report to the organization based on our qualifications and our training. And so, for instance, you mentioned the fire in the Cajon Pass. we will send strike teams with a strike team leader. They're duly trained, they've had the classes, they've been evaluated on fires, they perform, they just come right in and they respond and report to maybe a chief officer from that department and just go to work. It's just as natural as if they were working at their home location.
Well, thank you very, very much for your own service and for your sort of, I think, identifying these pieces of this puzzle of how do we coordinate from city and county and state and federal ways. And it's, we're not talking about an abstraction. We're obviously talking about real time and real consequences. And as you explained last night, one takes real pride in the kind of success stories, I think, that are represented by this cooperative mutual aid. If we all stayed within our own jurisdictions, said, we're not going to send anybody outside because we probably would not make it as a state. And it's the mutual aid and the supporting each other, and you said the training and the learning over time that's made this response by fire services successful. And so thank you, Mike, for your lifetime of service in this. And if somebody asked you, if your son asked you, should I join the fire service, knowing what you now know, what would you say?
Well, I say absolutely. I was really blessed to join this profession, and the opportunity to help people and serve people is a special one. It doesn't come without risk and seeing some awful things that happen in this world, but it's a rewarding job, and I've been very grateful to be able to serve in the profession for 36 years.
And much of that time I was either a council member or mayor of the city of Riverside, and when I looked at the best of people that served our city, Mike Esparza was always on my short list. Appreciate what you've done for the city and your lifetime work. I thank you for the presentation last night. There wasn't one person who attended that didn't find it important and learn things they didn't know before. And as we did this video, I think your own kind of commitment and understanding is clearly shown. So, Mike, thank you. And next time when there's a major fire and a major response, begin to understand a little bit how all this happens, and which is the purpose of the seminar, the purpose of the video. But, Mike, thanks very much.
It's a pleasure spending time with you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
The following programming is made possible through a generous donation from Randall Lewis, Executive Vice President of Upland-based Lewis Operating Companies.